All right, everyone. We are now live. Give folks a couple seconds to come in here. Welcome. Really appreciate you joining us today. We're here live with a very, very cool virtual panel talking to some experts who are very kind to join us today from Pew's Public Safety Performance Project and ATR President Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform President Grover Norquist. And we're talking about community supervision and probation and the importance of bringing conservative principles to reform in this area so that we can improve public safety and save some taxpayer dollars along the way by making things more efficient. So really appreciate you all joining us this afternoon. Very important topic to discuss. And I'm very pleased to turn things over to Americans for Tax Reform President Grover Norquist to kick us off. And then we'll have Tracy Velasquez and Connie Utada with Pew with a great presentation, new report from Pew on data on probation reform. So Grover, take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here with everybody. It's been more than a dozen years since a lot of conservatives became more active in criminal justice reform. It was particularly important because some of our friends on the left had lost credibility on the issue of criminal justice, with being perceived as weak on crime. And growing up in Massachusetts, I can assure you that was not always an unreasonable concern that people had when folks on the left spoke about crime and probation and parole. And as a result, things swung in one direction, and there weren't really conservative voices, practical voices about how do you minimize crime, how do you reduce crime as strongly as you can while as little disruption of the lives of families, and to punish those people who need to be punished, but not lock people in prison for longer than they need to be for more crimes than perhaps ought to exist. And how can we begin to rethink this? And we saw some very important steps forward. Many of the major conservative groups got together right on crime with sort of a coalition of groups that said, how can we reduce recidivism? How can we get people not to come back to prison if you do that? And of course, this began to a certain extent in Texas with people looking at the cost of building new prisons, and perhaps there are ways to have fewer people in prison and still get people not to commit crimes and to accurately punish crimes that need to be punished. And some baby steps were taken, and we actually saw some very good successes, questions about what you could do with drug courts instead of putting people in prison, how long people needed to be in prison for if you were trying to alter behavior, questions of civil asset forfeiture. Do we really want the police stealing $3 to $4 billion a year, which is more than people take in robberies, by taking assets from people who have been convicted, not necessarily convicted of anything, in order to have those assets taken? Mens rea, the idea that people should actually know that something that they did was against the law and wrong, and not go to prison because they filled out paperwork wrong and had no reason to believe that what they were doing was a violation of federal law somewhere, because one of 600,000 or so rules that were written not by Congress but by bureaucrats could actually end you up in trouble with the law. So as we saw all of these challenges, we saw some real successes. The First Step Act that Trump signed, we had a bipartisan effort in Congress that made that through. A lot of state legislators had some great successes. At Americans for Tax Reform, more recently, we focused on the lessons out of Ferguson, where everybody discovered that everyone hated the police, and the White House gave me all of their wonderful study that they'd done, and they found out that the police were used as tax collectors. And everyone hates the sheriff of Nottingham. Of course, people didn't get along with the police, and there were more outstanding warrants for people not paying fines and fees than there were citizens of Ferguson. And legislation was enacted in Missouri capping how much of a city's budget could come from fines and fees. And now people are moving. About 8 states have said you cannot have your driver's license taken away in order to get you to pay your parking tickets. You're driving into people, driving drunk, you can lose your driver's license, but not as a way to collect money for the government, is saying this is how we're going to get you to pay up. It's a little sort of a cross between the home arrest and debtor's prison. If you have to stay home because you can't drive your car legally, how are you supposed to get to work and earn the money to pay the fees and the fines, which is why they took away your driver's license in the first place. So there are really now a whole series of fronts on criminal justice reform. And one of them is parole and probation. What do you do probation instead of you sending someone to prison? What do you do on parole after somebody's been in prison, but before the state's willing to say, okay, you're completely on your own. We want to keep an eye on you for some while you're on parole. And today, we're going to be talking about probation and what's being suggested and what's been done in some states, taking a look at how perhaps fewer people on probation, perhaps less time on probation. How can you do that and still both dissuade people from committing crimes and getting people to not commit further crimes, and perhaps keep them out of prison, but even perhaps out of the system if necessary. And so we've got two experts with us from Pew, the foundation that's done a lot of the interesting work doing studies on what has worked and what has not worked in criminal justice reform. And they've got a slide presentation. Tracy or Connie, who's going to start off the, okay, Tracy Velasquez, and she'll be followed with Connie Utada to take a look at what they see as possible on probation reform. There's prison reform, how do you treat people in prison? There's civil asset reform about how to get the government not to steal your money, mens rea reform on making sure that people actually know what the laws are. And then there's questions about whether you want sentences that are fixed and minimum sentences. It's not always a good idea. I testified on the 18-to-1 ratio on crack cocaine to regular white powder cocaine, suggesting that it should be a 1-to-1 ratio. We got it down to 18-to-1 from 100. That was the big victory there. And we may actually at some point go to 1-to-1. I don't think that's happened yet. They keep talking about it happening any moment. But with mandatory minimums, these are often press conferences. People want to say, I really don't like pornographic pictures, so 45 years. And then they put a number to it. And as you look at it, the numbers and the crimes don't really match each other. It's 5 years for treason and about 45 years for dirty pictures. So some of this stuff is governing by press conference rather than thinking it through. So with that said, we want to take a look at one of the new areas that conservatives can and should be focused on, and that is probation. Tracy?
Thanks so much. I appreciate the introduction. So yeah, as Grover noted, we are going to be looking at probation in the United States today. And I just wanted to emphasize that, as Grover said, probation is a period of supervision in place of incarceration, as opposed to parole, which is usually a tagged on the end. So if you have a 3 to 5 year prison sentence, maybe the last year, but you might be on parole. Sometimes you'll hear post-prison supervision called probation, but we're not really talking about that. We're mostly talking about today probation, what's called straight probation or regular probation, which is instead of prison. So go ahead and you can move on to the next slide. So I just wanted to sort of give folks a little bit of the landscape before we talk about our research and some of our policy recommendations. Probation is the largest piece of the U.S. correctional population. This graph shows the growth of the correctional population, which peaks around 2007 and then has decreased somewhat since then, but obviously not back down to levels that it was 30, 40 years ago. Probation reached its high of about 4.3 million people in 2007. Since then, like the other correctional populations, we've seen a decline down to about 3.5 million people in 2018. Interestingly, for the past 10 years, the share of the correctional population that is on probation has remained the same. It's been about 69%. It hasn't changed. As everything else has fallen, probation's fallen. It doesn't seem like more people are going on probation instead of prison or less on probation. It's been pretty constant. So if you'd like to go to the next slide. Sorry, I didn't realize there was motion on that slide. So as these charts show, most people on probation and parole actually as well are not on supervision because their primary offense was a violent one. For probation, over half are on probation for a drug or property offense. So you can see that in the left-hand donut. There's more people on public order offense probation than for parole, and that's mostly DWIs, DUIs. That makes up the biggest share of that. So while we don't have trend data going back 10 years or more on on whether people on probation are there for a felony or misdemeanor, we do have it for the past several years, and we know about half of the people on probation for a felony and about half are on probation for a misdemeanor or other type of a violation. Next. So judges using probation in lieu of jail or prison, they want to know that people can be supervised in the community without jeopardizing public safety. The idea is really that this is, you're giving someone a chance to stay connected in the community, keep their jobs, stay connected with their families, while also being held accountable for breaking the law. And in fact, about 7 in 10 people do successfully complete their probation. They meet all the requirements, they do what they're supposed to do, and they are discharged. They get off paper, as folks often say. However, about 1 in 5 unsuccessfully exit probation and they go to jail or prison. Only about 5% of the folks on supervision are incarcerated for a new offense, for being convicted of a new offense while on supervision. And many of those who are sent back to prison or jail, it's due to their probation being revoked. So a revocation is when someone is incarcerated for violating the conditions of supervision. This can be things like not showing up for a meeting, failing a drug test, or not meeting some other special condition, which might involve any number of things, from travel to a variety of other conditions. A standard condition of probation is generally also obeying all laws. And so some people can be revoked based on probation officers' belief that, or evidence that they have indeed broken a law. The level of proof for revocation is generally lower than that for a new conviction. It's a preponderance of evidence. And so, for low-level offenses, a prosecutor might agree to the probation officer just revoking the probation and sending them back for the remainder of their probation term rather than going back to court. We really don't know how many revocations are for low-level offenses, but I think it's safe to assume that if a prosecutor felt someone deserved a new sentence, they would be on the new commitment side rather than on the revocation side. While it's a minority of people on probation who do fail and go back to prison, because there's so many people on prison, this adds up to a lot of people. So in 2018, this added up to about 200,000 people who went back to prison or jail due to failing probation. Next. For many, probation offers an opportunity to get connected with needed services. Grover mentioned drug courts and the role that they have played in getting people services for their substance use issues. And as you can see, many people on probation, as many as 46%, are in need of treatment for a drug issue. So probation can serve an important purpose, just like something like a drug court does. However, it's also important to know that services in the community are also important for this as well. I just also wanted to mention that later this year, we'll have a new report out looking at probation and mental health issues, which are also more prevalent among the probation population than the general public. Next. There's been sort of an ongoing debate about what the purpose of parole and probation are. Are they to punish? Are they to provide rehabilitation? And I think the answer, like with a lot of things, is it's some of both. As this 2018 survey results show, about 2 in 5 Americans, about 3 in 5 Americans see the primary purpose of supervision as helping people get back on track so that they can lead productive, law-abiding lives. And this is really the way that probation has been moving for the past several years in terms of reform. So looking at ways to help people be successful and not just find ways to feed them back into the system where they cycle in and out again. So next. This brings us to our report that came out earlier this year on probation lengths of stay. So why is probation length important? If you look at it from the perspective of probation instead of prison, obviously it's costs less money, it's less, it doesn't infringe on freedoms as much, but it still has a cost. So first, it has a cost to supervision agencies, which are paid for by you and me as taxpayers. While it's less expensive than prison, it's still more expensive than not supervising someone who would be law-abiding in the community anyway. And what it does is it moves these costs when people are on supervision unnecessarily, when they could have been in the off of supervision safely, then it's moving costs to people who don't need the supervision and away from people who do. And that's usually people right as they get onto supervision, and also people who are high risk of reoffending. So what we're doing is misusing funds on people who don't need it instead of on people who are. And finally, probation can interfere with people's lives. Some employers don't want to hire people on probation because they don't want a probation officer showing up at their restaurant or their workplace to check on someone. And supervision conditions can make it hard for people to travel for work or to see family. And while most people who are going to reoffend do so early on probation term, and that we'll talk about in a minute, they are still at risk of tripping up and going to jail. So the entire time, if you're on probation for years and years, that entire time you are sort of walking on pins and needles in terms of any minor offenses or rule violations that you might have that for an ordinary person wouldn't even be breaking the law, but could send you to jail or prison. Next. So at this point, I just wanted to sort of walk through some of the findings of this report. So the first of this, so what we did was we looked at probation lengths across the country, and this data is not available. Like there's no place on the web where you can look and see what the average length of probation is in any state or nationally. So what we did is we calculated it based on when people came into probation and when they left. And we looked at it nationally and across the states. And if you talk with your own state, they may come up with a different number because the number of people who are reported to the feds for probation may be different than the way that they count them. For example, they might not include misdemeanor probation people when they're talking about their average lengths, or they may not be including people who are on probation at the local level versus the state. But as we looked at this data, what we saw was the average length of probation was about 22.4 months, so a little bit less than 2 years. But this ranged across the board from almost 6 years in New Jersey and Hawaii to a low of about 6 years to about less than a year in places like Massachusetts and Kansas. So where you are on probation really affects how long you spend on probation, how long your term of probation is. Next. And then we looked at sentences. So when you think about it, there's sort of two pieces to it. Just as there are with a prison sentence, you might have a sentence of so many years, but you might get off early for good behavior or whatever onto parole. The same thing was with probation. So we looked at the laws that govern probation, and we saw is that these also vary very much by state. So you'll see a lot of states allow only a maximum of 2 years for a misdemeanor sentence, but some states allow much longer. They'll allow 5 years for a misdemeanor sentence of probation, which is much longer than a sentence of incarceration generally for a misdemeanor, which is often just a year. And some allow the maximum sentence that you could have for that offense. So a lot of variation in terms of sentences for misdemeanors for probation. Next. And again, the same thing for sentences for felonies. While most of the states what we looked at had like a 5-year cap was pretty common, a lot of them could be on probation for the maximum length of the sentence. So if it's a state that allows a sentence of up to 20 years for an offense, someone could be on probation for up to 20 years, which is a lot of your adult life to be under the supervision of the government and have to ask permission as an adult to do things like go see your mother in another state or take a job in another state. So these sentences that are extremely long have a big impact on people's lives. Next. So we decided to look at sort of on the back end, what can states do to shorten some of these sentences? So sort of like the equivalent of good time in a prison setting. So first we looked at court authority to dismiss someone from probation. Most states have it. 40 states have it. But whether they use it or not is really up to the individual courtroom and the individual judge. So you have a lot of discretion, a lot of variability there. So, will a judge let someone off probation early? It probably depends on whether a probation officer is inclined to bring them before the court and that sort of thing. And, I guess I should probably mention it here now. In terms of money, most states have a probation fee of $20 or $30 a month. So there is sort of a disincentive in some ways to reduce probation, because if you have a probationer who's doing everything right, not staying in trouble, not getting in trouble, all those sorts of things, you're getting $30 a month to fund your probation department. Whereas if you let them off, then you lose that funding. So we are really interested in how these fees play into length of probation, but we have not done research on it yet. There are other ways that people can get off early. One is for earned time, and you can see that only 16 states allow people to earn their time off of probation. And then you can see there's a couple other ways, but generally speaking, there's just not many states have really clear ways for people to reduce their probation sentence length. Next. So we were really interested in, sort of what we know about how people reoffend, and the fact that people who don't reoffend in the first, months or year of probation tend to not offend later. Most of this happens early in a probation term. We decided to really look at what the impact would be of if you were to shorten probation terms. And so what we did is we worked with a researcher who looked at data from 2 states, Oregon and South Carolina. And we used them because they had really good data that they allowed us to use that connected criminal history with the probation data and with arrest data. And what we saw was that because there's so much variation from judge to judge and courtroom to courtroom, we could find similarly situated people who were either still on probation or had been let off of probation after a year of being arrest-free. What we saw was that most of the folks who were on probation could have served a term as much as a year less without having any effect on recidivism. So whether someone got arrested or not was completely not related to how long they spent on probation. They could have served at least a year less of time on probation. Next. So what would have happened if they had actually reduced people's probation terms to the length that could have been done without jeopardizing public safety? What we see is that they could have reduced the average daily population in both of these states by thousands of individuals. So this would have meant less of a burden on probation officers, better ability to serve those who needed it most, rather than spending time on folks who don't really need to be on supervision at all. Next. So finally, I just wanted to conclude with, I think I'm concluding with, the fact that, when you're thinking about probation populations, there's 2 things that affect any correctional population: how many people go in and how long they stay. This is the same with prisons, with jails, and it's the same with probation. So what we did is we looked at states that had rising probation populations over the period of 2000 to 2018, which was about half of the states. And most of these states had their length of stay of their supervision, of their probation, also rise. So you can see that these rising probation lengths are keeping states from being able to reduce their probation populations and the burden that those large populations cause on taxpayers and on the people on probation themselves. So just to sum up, what we saw was probation by location. There's, which again speaks to, is there a public safety value if you can serve 2 years in one state, but you're serving 5 years in another? Many could have safely served less time on probation. And looking at reducing the length of time people spend on probation can help shrink the population of people on probation. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Connie, who can talk about some of the policies and practices that we have studied and looked at in order to improve community supervision.
Great. Thanks so much, Tracy. And thanks everybody for joining this afternoon. Before I jump into kind of a couple of the policy considerations, I just wanted to highlight last year, 2020, Pew, along with its partners, produced this framework, this policy framework, Policy Reforms Can Strengthen Community Supervision. You can find it on our website. This document was developed as a way to provide jurisdictions with additional policy resources, kind of a menu of policy options focused on probation and parole, to try to help probation and parole systems function more effectively based on research and evidence-based practices. You know, as every system has had to adjust due to the pandemic, we've seen that in the correction space, states have found ways to respond to this crisis, such as limiting revocations, you know, but for the most serious offenses. They've expedited release of individuals from prison and jail populations. And as people exit incarceration, jurisdictions may find their supervision systems actually growing more than anticipated, especially as courts reopen. So this framework can be a useful tool to help support jurisdictions manage this change, the need for social distancing, and the challenge on budgets. So by way of a brief background, we began this process in 2018, and Pew, in partnership with Arnold Ventures, put together an advisory council to identify key policies and discuss the research on this specific community supervision area. Next slide, Doug. As I had mentioned, the policy framework was released in April of 2020 and now has the following endorsements, along with over 30 criminal justice professionals. Hit the next slide. Yeah. This council, as you can see here, featured a diverse group of representatives from probation and parole agencies, law enforcement, the judiciary, impacted individuals, the behavioral health field, advocates, and academia. And we also contracted with the Robina Institute, based out of the University of Minnesota, to provide a research foundation for the policies discussed. The focus of the policies had the following goals in mind. One, to get better outcomes for people on supervision, their families and communities. Two, to create a smaller system targeting supervision on those that need it. And three, to have fewer revocations for violations, particularly those resulting in incarceration. So here are the 7 buckets that the policy framework is organized into. And the sections and policies begin with arrest, diversion, and sentencing options, and kind of touch every part of the system as someone moves through supervision. The policies also hit on culture change and practice implementation. What we found through our kind of many years of technical assistance with states and jurisdictions, kind of community supervision, that space is kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of implementation, and how policies get implemented really has a lot to do with how effective they can be. And here I'm just highlighting the third section, adopting shorter supervision terms based on incentives and goals that change behavior, as it specifically addresses length of stay. And as Tracy had mentioned, you know, there are 2 ways to safely impact the population size. One is through admissions, and the next is through how long people are staying on supervision. So next slide, Doug. So this is looking specifically at the policies outlined in this section, all focusing on the time individuals spend on supervision. And I'm going to just highlight a few of these just to kind of pique some interest here. But if you could hit the arrow button, Doug, I think it'll just come up with like a little highlight. So, yep. As Tracy noted, and research demonstrates, long supervision terms can deliver diminishing public safety benefits. Community supervision really is a process that is meant and intended to help individuals improve their lives and avoid future criminal behavior. So goal-based supervision is kind of the one that is the first one that we're talking about. And that advances those aims by establishing a clear set of objectives for each individual and really encouraging success by allowing early termination of supervision once the individual fulfills specified goals. So it oftentimes begins with the officer working together with the individual on supervision, creating a customized plan of objectives such as full-time employment, stable housing, of course, not committing any, offenses. And, as the individual kind of continues to either meet those goals and kind of sustain those goals, they can work their plan and work to get off of supervision based on that kind of compliant behavior. The second one is earned compliance credits, which Tracy kind of touched on briefly. Research shows that incentives actually are more effective than sanctions, and the use of earned credits is a way to incentivize positive behavior. A recent study from 2017, and maybe it's not so recent now, but 4 years ago, found that earned compliance credits actually were the most highly valued incentive among individuals on supervision. So effective earned compliance programs really establish the process for earning these credits upfront. They inform the individual that, you know, they're going to, if they are able to remain compliant and they lay out what that means for that person, then they will be able to earn these credits and time off of supervision as a way to incentivize them to continue to kind of modify and change their behavior. We did a policy evaluation of Missouri's earned compliance credit policy. They adopted one in 2012. It was a 30 days of credit for 30 days of compliant behavior. And what they, and their real intention was because their caseloads were so large. So over the course of 3 years, they were able to reduce their population by 18% and really shrink their caseloads by 16%. And that reduction in caseloads, they still had, you know, significant caseloads, but they were able to really focus their attention on the high risk individuals, the people who really needed that attention, and allow the people who are, you know, compliant, typically lower risk, to earn their way off and to remain off. They did a study of that population. So it was 13,000 people that were terminated early from supervision. And of that 13,000, there was only an 8% recidivism rate. So, you know, and as Tracy shared in the nationwide kind of chart, supervision terms vary widely across the country. And the last one is capping supervision terms and limiting the time a person can spend on supervision. It still aligns with the goals of holding individuals accountable. It allows sufficient time for rehabilitation and treatment, and it protects public safety. It also enables supervision agencies to concentrate these same kind of limited supervision resources on individuals with the highest likelihood of reoffending. I think similar to the prison context, where you really want to focus that most expensive punishment resource on the people who, you know, need to be there, who are most likely to commit offenses, typically, you know, have had violent offenses. Similar with community supervision resources, they have a limited budget. The people that the attention needs to be focused on are those who are similarly high risk. And so if you limit that supervision term for those individuals, you can really focus on the ones who need it. But there are a lot of other policies in the framework, and I'd encourage anyone to take a look at it, you know, and reach out if you have specific questions about your state or jurisdiction. Turning it back over to you, Doug.
Okay, great. It should be unmuted now. No, really appreciate the presentation. That was extremely informative, and we do have some questions. Let's go to the comments here. William O'Brien, are rising rates and lengths of probation inversely related to short incarceration terms?
So we really haven't seen any sort of relationship. As I said, the percentage of the correctional population that has been taken up by probation has been really steady, even as these populations have fallen. So we really aren't seeing any sort of a correlation there between more people on probation and fewer shorter prison sentence terms. So it seems like those are they're running along on separate but parallel tracks, I would say.
Tracy, Grover here. Is there a state or two that people point to and say, that one seems to work better, either because they're numbers or just everybody says so? And is there one or two that seem to be worse? And I guess, and what are you measuring? I mean,
yeah.
One can imagine one could shorten times if one did things better, but I'm not sure that shortening times is the measurement you're looking for. But people not going back to prison, people not committing more crimes. How do you look? Is it some states you could say, that's better? I mean, in civil asset forfeiture, you can say, this state doesn't let you steal stuff and let it take your money unless you've been convicted. That's better than being arrested and having them take your car. What's the metric? And are there a couple of states people point to? Are they?
We're actually, and I'll let Connie take over, because we're right in the beginning stages of taking a look at that. And I don't know if Connie, if you want to talk about your upcoming project.
Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard question to answer. One, because we know that states operate so differently, especially within the world of probation. You have some under the judiciary, some under the executive branch, and then some kind of a combination of judiciary and county-based, or executive and county-based. So it's hard to kind of measure what they are able to do and the resources they have at their disposal. If you are looking to reduce length of stay, then there are definitely some states that you could look at in terms of their capping of supervision, or kind of giving it's kind of allowing the supervision agency to kind of guide when they believe that the person is ready to kind of early terminate from supervision. We did an informal study. Some do kind of point to Maricopa County as not as a model jurisdiction, but as a jurisdiction that people hold highly. I think, one, they have a very large population of people, and so they're able to manage that population in a way that doesn't lead to high numbers of revocations in the way that some other places may go to. I think they're a little bit more well-resourced than other jurisdictions. So I think there's a lot of metrics that one could think about in terms of what should be measuring. Like, should we even be measuring, long-term employment or sustained housing for significant periods to determine success? I think right now, the one key measurement that folks have focused on is just recidivism. And I think that people don't want to compare that from state to state or jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because they measure recidivism differently in each one of those places. So it's hard to say. So I think it depends on kind of what we're looking at.
And yeah, a reminder to the audience, now is the time to ask questions. We'll go a few more minutes here with questions. So please submit them, and whether on YouTube or Facebook, we can see your questions. Have a second question from the audience. As marijuana laws change, how does this affect probation? Many municipalities have let minor offenses go.
Well, I will just say, because we had been discussing it last week, I know that Oregon had legislation pending that altered the definition of a revocation around drug use, revocation around obeying laws, to actually exclude. So you have to obey all laws, all federal and state laws, and it sort of carved out federal drug laws, because marijuana is still illegal federally, which I thought was interesting. So they were trying to basically codify what Kathleen's pointing out, which is that some have sort of informally stopped using that as a way to revoke people. I haven't heard about other potential reforms. I don't know if, Connie, if you've heard of any.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about the marijuana laws is also a response by certain supervision agencies to really limit who gets tested for drugs. Typically, substance use and drug testing is just kind of, it's a standard condition for everyone on supervision, regardless if you have a, drug charge or drug offense or any of those things. Some places started to really focus on, let's test the people who actually have a drug addiction, and also it's a way to save a lot of money for those jurisdictions. And so when that's the case, then some of the kind of marijuana offenses may not get picked up as frequently. So that's the one thing to consider. Are you using marijuana, or are you committing a new offense, especially if that state has now legalized marijuana? I know some jurisdictions allow their probationers to, if they have like a medical reason to use marijuana, then they won't violate them for that kind of condition of if they test positive for marijuana. And I think that there is somewhat some leniency, but then there are states that, if you test positive for marijuana with a drug charge and you are, you're testing regularly, then you will get violated, and that potentially could lead to a revocation, and you could potentially go to prison or jail for that.
I mean, I think the main focus, at least in my mind, is, are we helping people who have a drug addiction get off drugs, and so they can lead a meaningful life? And so, even in terms of drug testing, is it being used to punish, or is it being used to say, hey, I think we need to get you into some treatment? So I think looking at how we break the cycle where people are cycling between jail and probation and prison because of addiction is really sort of the core issue that I think probation agencies are trying to take a harder look at.
I think one question via email that goes back to probably the first question we had is, what is the connection, if any, between crime rates, which I think we all know have been declining over recent decades, and probation, as we've seen that population go way up? Is there a connection?
Well, the population has decreased, not quite as much as crime has. So the probation population went down, I think roughly 13% in the past decade, whereas crime's gone down 19%. So I would say that it's not an exact match. We've seen that we've sort of held on to some of the correctional responses maybe, but I think that it's trended in the same direction, but maybe not quite as fast as the drop in crime.
Okay. Another question from the live stream. Does Pew or any other group have model state legislation for reforming probation?
We don't have model legislation, but what we do have is we have state examples that are highlighted in that policy framework, which kind of outline and show a number of key policy initiatives, these 50 state initiatives or policy ideas and options. In that policy framework, we note statutes and other kinds of judicial code policies from different states that exemplify kind of what an effective policy would look like in that area. I think it was hard for us to think about model legislation specifically because these systems operate so differently throughout the country.
Okay, very good. More audience questions. We have a good audience today. Based on your research, how many years should probation be capped at?
Generally, when we've talked with experts and looked at what's effective, by the time someone's on probation 2 years, their likelihood of reoffending is really low. If you could picture it, sort of like the curve kind of goes like this. So most of the reoffending would happen in the first 6 months and then the first year. And after someone's been on probation a year, if they haven't reoffended, they're probably not going to reoffend. So, I mean, there's obviously other reasons that people are put on probation because it's, there might be other concerns that are specific to that person. But even if it's something like, we want to make sure that they complete their drug treatment program, all of that's usually able to be done within 18 months to a year. So Connie, would you like to add anything?
I think we covered that, Tracy.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask whether technology has made it easier to follow somebody on probation? There's the ankle bracelets that we see on TV. There's people with GPS and a phone, so you could call them with voice recognition, know it's that person, and know that they're at work because that's where they picked up the phone. And you don't have to have a probation officer walk into the restaurant to see if you're there. I talked to people in Georgia who were doing this. They used to have little old ladies call people on the phone and do their voice recognition. I'm just not sure how many different people you can remember what exactly their voice sounds like, but a computer can. And a computer can call people, every 3 or 4 hours, doesn't cost anything. It is that person and you know where they are. I mean, does this not make it much easier to have a light touch as opposed to knocking on the door and embarrassing everybody because your probation officer's there?
Yeah, I think during the pandemic, a lot of agencies have been using technology as a way to either have their in-office or their kind of in-person visits, but via virtual. And anecdotally, we've heard that it's actually been a much more effective way to have conversations with probation agents because they're not kind of intruding in their own private space, but they're still able to see their family, see how they're living and those kinds of things. That's been really useful. I think one thing that we've also heard is that there is a technological divide in certain parts of the country where you just don't get access to Wi-Fi. And so these rural areas make it a little bit more challenging. But I've definitely been hearing across the country that more and more agencies are wanting to shift to use technology more as a way to kind of support their ability to monitor folks.
Very good question. And we're starting to run over time. So let's do one last question and go a little bit over if everyone can stay with us. Do most of the policy proposals require an upfront investment from the state? A question near and dear to our hearts.
Actually, a lot of them don't. These are policies that they can implement, and I mean, they'd obviously have to get passed in some capacity, but definitely can, in terms of all of the policies regarding revocations, they would be more likely saving dollars than anything, since you're limiting the amount of time that people are spending on supervision. And there are some policies that are very minor, but that could lead to a really effective result, like just defining what technical violations are. Many states, both in statute and in policy, don't even define what that means. And so making it very clear to the person on supervision, if you do this, it's a technical violation. If you commit a new offense, it's not a technical violation, or whatever it is. There are definitely policies that would require some upfront investment, especially in terms of like the kind of programming and services. But I think there are a lot of other effective practices that could lead to supervision that is focusing on the people who are high risk and allowing the folks who are compliant to kind of move their way off of supervision in a more expedited way.
Yep, and shout out to Tennessee. Governor Lee's legislation would define technical violation, which is welcome because that does create confusion. Okay, we are out of time. We appreciate everybody staying an extra minute or two. Very much appreciate the audience for tuning in, and we'll keep this up on YouTube and Facebook after the fact. And thank you very much to Tracy, Connie, and Grover for being generous with their time today and joining us on this really important topic. So thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us. Yep.
Take it easy.
Very well.